For the past few years, our nation has been revisiting the journey of explorers Lewis and Clark. Perhaps the most celebrated television documentary about their exploration was produced for PBS by Ken Burns and historian Dayton Duncan. When Duncan recently returned to Iowa, Morgan Halgren explored with him his fascination with the mission that literally helped put our state on the map.
Award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker Dayton Duncan was born and raised in Indianola, Iowa. After graduating from the University of Pennsylvania, he settled in New Hampshire and before long became involved in state and national politics. But a fascination with American history eventually consumed him, and he has pursued that passion ever since. Among his pursuits are 9 books on American history and politics. For 15 years, he has served as writer, consultant, and co-producer for Ken Burns' celebrated television documentaries, namely The Civil War, baseball, Mark Twain, and Dayton's favorite topic, Lewis and Clark. Dayton Duncan, welcome back to Iowa.
It's great to be back here.
At what point did your fascination with history kick in?
I think it was my time in politics that actually ignited my interest in history. I got into politics working as a chief of staff for a governor, in which you're seeing decisions being made. And somehow the connection started to fire in my brain if I was reading about American history, that they're just like me. Those people are just like me, only in a different time. They're trying to do the best they can, making decisions that they don't know how they're going to turn out, but that they do know could have an effect, a ripple effect on the future. And that humanized it for me, I think. And it was right around the same time that a friend gave me a copy of the 1-volume edition of the Lewis and Clark journals. And I read that with a real voracious interest of seeing it with new eyes, of that these were people. They weren't just facts, they weren't just names, it wasn't just dates to remember. They were stories to tell. And that changed my life.
Do you think it's also the stepping back in time that fascinates you about history?
I love the notion of going back in time, and it's sort of that conjunction of the similarity of humanity and the different place and time that fascinates me.
You mentioned that you got into history sort of via politics. Are you still involved in politics?
Well, you know, I was the chief of staff to a governor of New Hampshire. I was very involved in Walter Mondale's campaign in 1984, press secretary for Dukakis in '88. And so I get involved in state politics as a advisor to friends of mine who were, one's now a governor, and I get involved in the presidential campaigns every 4 years. I give free advice, and that's about what it's worth.
In your book, Scenes of Visionary Enchantment, your latest book, you have readily admitted that you have an obsession with Lewis and Clark. And I wondered, how deep is this obsession?
I've got it as bad as you can have it. I call it Lewis and Clark-itis. It's a contagious disease, infectious. Once you've got it, it's incurable. And it starts off with a desire to read everything you can about it. And stage 2 is you want to go to all the places that they were at. Stage 3 is a place where you might wake up on September 3rd and say, okay, September 3rd, well, in 1804 they would have been just past Sioux City, Iowa, and in 1805 they would be about to enter the Bitterroot Mountains, and in 1806, and then you'd walk down and realize that it's your birthday. And that's also just a great story. You can think you know it, and it turns out there's still more things to learn because of the journals, because there's this wealth of information, of the first-hand accounts, of the first American citizens to see the Western United States before it was changed forever.
Let's talk about your latest obsession, which is the national parks, a story about a 5-part series, right?
Right.
About the national parks. Why did you want to tell that story, and when will we see it?
The idea of a national park we sort of take for granted now, but it was an idea that was born here in the United States in the midst of the Civil War. The notion of taking a beautiful, special place, in this case Yosemite, and setting it aside, saving it, not for the royalty, not for the richest people, not for the political insiders, but for everybody. That was as radical an idea in 1864 across the world as the Declaration of Independence had been 100 years earlier. Our plan is to have the National Park series, to have that completed in 2008 with an air date sometime in 2009.
When you're writing a book, you can paint the picture with words, but if you're talking about 200 years ago and you don't have an image for what you're trying to show, how do you fill in?
Each film presents its own challenges and its own complications, and sometimes its own opportunities. Civil War, the visual bread and butter of that film, are the old, beautiful glass plate negative photographs taken during the Civil War. When we did Lewis and Clark, they were very inconsiderate of documentary filmmakers by embarking 40 years before the invention of photography. So there weren't any photographs to use. There were only a few paintings, portraits of Lewis and of Clark and of a few of the men to use. So it was a real challenge for us visually, so that rather than looking into their eyes, as we had done in the Civil War series, we became their eyes.
It seems to me that you make a real effort not to glorify history. You talk about these fallible people and less than perfect human beings, but how do you resist that temptation to glorify it when you are so entranced by it yourself?
I think what Ken and I feel is that you've got to be willing to look with clear eyes at a historical person or a historical moment. And with clear eyes can also give them credit where credit is due, but to show a person warts and all. Meriwether Lewis took his own life 3 years after the expedition. William Clark was a slaveholder who refused to give York his freedom for many years after the expedition. That's part of who they are. I still think they did heroic things, and there's much of what they did that I admire. And to whitewash their shortcomings would be unfair to history and to a certain extent unfair to them. And so if imperfect people, fallible human beings, are capable of doing great and heroic things, well, then maybe we're all capable of doing that.
Well, finally, I'd like to ask you, in your experience of researching and writing and producing the Lewis and Clark story, can you paint a picture for us of a golden moment for you in that whole process?
I just happened to be in a group of people canoeing through the white cliffs of the Missouri with what was described to me as some professor from New Orleans, who turned out to be Stephen Ambrose, who turned out to make my fascination with Lewis and Clark seem like a puppy love. And we camped the first night right across from this beautiful white sandstone cliffs, pretty much in the same place that they camped on May 31st, 1805, when Lewis wrote one of my favorite passages from the entire journey about what he called scenes of visionary enchantment. And as the sun went down, Steve did what he would always do whenever he was anywhere on the trail, is he got out the journals and he made us, who were with him, look out at the scene, and then he read Lewis's words. And I can still hear his voice over the course of, 15 years or more, 20 years. Had a lot of great adventures along the trail, but that first time at that campfire at the White Cliffs will remain right here.
Wonderful. Thank you. We'll just look forward to all your upcoming projects.
Thank you very much.